What I want to know is, out of all the stories you told me, which ones were true and which ones weren't?
They're all true.
Even the lies.
Especially the lies.
Ugh. Buckle up, kids, because this is going to be a long one, and it is one I feel I needed to do before touching on other material, as Code Geass and the impact Code Geass had ends up tying into not one, not two, but three of this year's subject matter, and thus I felt, instead of a biopsy on it, that a much longer discussion of the series was required. This production is way too long, and I don't even go through the series episode by episode like I usually do.
王様は国民全員を守ってる。だから僕たちは手の届く大切な人たちを守る。
For those not aware, Code Geass is the story of Lelouch v. Britannia, the exiled 11th prince of the Holy Britannian Empire, which is an alternate universe version of America which never gained its independence from Great Britain after George Washington's Revolution failed. And in the aftermath of Great Britain falling to Napoleon, the royal family fled to the Americas and consolidated their power there, before expanding their reach over the following centuries into a world-dominating superpower. And yes, that is the canonical backstory of the Rise of Britannia. More on that later, as there are a bunch of idiots in the fandom who somehow think that Britannia is separate from America entirely, when no, they are one and the same. In Lelouch's youth, his mother and sister were attacked in an assault on their home, leaving the former dead and the latter crippled and blind. And when he asked his father for justice in their name, said father, Emperor Charles Z. Britannia, told him to his face that he was nothing and did not matter to him, and summarily banished Lelouch and Nunnally to Japan, which was not long after invaded by his father, seemingly to gain a resource Japan possessed, the superconductor material Sakurai. But in actuality, it was for far more nefarious reasons motivating their actions, which had nothing to do with Sakurai or the country at all. Both were merely stepping stones to his true cause. However, said superconductor allows for Britannia to construct and power the mecha for the series, known as the Nightmares, which Lelouch's mother Marianne had championed as a capable war machine for their country after she used the first Nightmare to dominate the battlefield and helped Charles claim the throne to begin with. Meaning with Japan under their control, they have unlimited access to Sakuraites, with which to enable their conquest of what parts of the world they don't already own. Lelouch and Nunnally were intended to be killed amidst the war to act as martyrs in their father's schemes, only for them to narrowly escape that fate. Lelouch walking through the sea of corpses his family created with Nunnally in his back to reach safety, abandoned by all who claimed to love them. Renamed Area 11, Japan was occupied, with Lelouch and Nunnally going under the assumed surname of Lamperouge, and taking refuge with exiled allies of their mother, the same ones who actually created the original Nightmares of the series, who summarily constructed a school they enrolled in as students to hide in plain sight, until the day Lelouch crossed paths with a group of Japanese resistance fighters, spearheaded by the half-Britannian firebrand Callan Kozuki, and got caught up in their battle with the occupation force over a capsule that contained the woman CC, who was being experimented upon by one of Lelouch's half-siblings. As in the wake of their assumed deaths, every relative Lelouch had been close to had in their own ways broken from the loss, and in the years since allowed themselves to embrace being just as callous, cruel, and corrupt as their bastard of a sperm donor, in only considering their own wants and no others.
そこで何やってるんですか街で人が
それは悲しいな尊い犠牲だ
民を守るのが王じゃないんですか
民は道具私が国だ
Though to interject, as I know some will ask, Cece's name is supposed to be pronounced as C2, as it's just her initials. But the Japanese phonetic spelling and their pronunciation of two makes such sound like Shi-Tzu, as in Shih Tzu, the breed of dog. I'll get into why later, but That was deliberate, and while I am not a fan of the character, I mispronounce it deliberately to create some level of dissociation from calling her a bitch. CC, as is eventually revealed near the series' end, is a former ally of Lelouch's mother that has watched over him at a distance since her death, at least before she was captured, and is a holder of the power of Code, a magic contract that grants the bearer immortality and the power to bestow a Geass, a psychic ability initially based off of the Irish mythological curse of gaze, most associated with the hero Ku Kulane. CC in turn giving Lelouch a Geass to fulfill her own purposes, granting him a power that matches the magic of its Irish namesake. That of absolute command.
ルルーシュビブリタニアが命じる貴様たちは死ねイエスよハイネスあの日から俺はずっと嘘をついていた全く変わらない世界に飽き飽きしてでも嘘って絶望で諦めることもできなくてだから
With this new power and his near-death experience driving him to act and not just waste away in anonymity, he takes on the guise of Zero, the maker of miracles, which comes from the man who is nothing, and begins to lead the Japanese resistance anew. Reformed as the Order of the Black Knights, heroes for justice with the ultimate aim of righting the wrongs his family and their supporters have inflicted on the world that have turned it to hell. All ultimately motivated because his little sister wished the world would become a kinder, more gentle place, and he wanted to make that world a reality. But due to his experiences, Lelouch had long come to the realization that such a world would only come about if everything that made Britannia a tyrannical force was broken by any means possible, as the justice of Britannia only served to victimize those that were not at the top. And those who did not conform to the ideology of the elite would be used up, thrown out, and tossed away, just as they were as children.
人々よ我らを恐れ求めるがいい我々黒の騎士団武器を持たない全ての者の味方であるイレブンだろうとブリタニア人であろうと私は戦いを否定しないしかし強い者が弱い者を一方的に殺すことは断じて許さない撃っていいのは撃たれる覚悟のあるやつだけだ我々は力ある者が力なき者を襲うとき再び現れるだろうたとえその敵がどれだけ大きな力を持っているとしても
正義の味方
力ある者よ我を恐れよ力なき者よ我を求めよ世界は我々黒の騎士団が裁く
貴様の語る正義などくだらんつまらん気に食わん子供たちを犠牲にすることが正義なら俺は正義をぶっ潰す悪になってやる貴様を打ち滅ぼす者の名はいや俺様が世界を支配する
Assisting him in all this is the aforementioned Callan, call sign Q1, the true Knight of Zero, who is popularly considered the show's best character alongside Lelouch, for she acts as the deuteragonist of the series, enabling much of what Lelouch can do outside of his Geass abilities due to her possessing connections, physical prowess, perspective, and drive Lelouch himself lacks. Callan herself being an extremely talented pilot of the Nightmares. In fact, she is presented as being the single best pilot in the series, to the point that the writing team had to keep pulling narrative bullshit to nerf her when she was already fighting far above her weight class, whom Lelouch shares a complex dynamic with both behind and beyond their masks, as she likewise wants to free the world from Britannia's tyranny to live a free life with her ailing mother, after having survived the invasion herself and spent years living as an 11, people of the countries that Britannia conquers reduced from having their national names to just a number instead, before being taken from her mother's arms by her biological father to be his heir, and then after that losing her elder brother when he was murdered not long before the first episode's events, which drove her to rage against the system of nobility responsible for every horrible event in her life. As from having seen it from both sides like Lelouch has, she just as much despises the current system and wants to tear it all down to give the Japanese and others oppressed as numbers their freedom again, instead of giving up and conforming to a lie of high society civility that primally disgusts her. Callan acts as the only acknowledged mixed-origin character in the series, and represents what someone of that dual background can experience with the decisions before them, and the only real choice one can make if one were to back up any claim to being a moral person.
この度の比例誠にやっぱ無理だ
俺はこびねえへつらわねえ誰が相手になろうと意地とドタマでぶっちぎる俺は誰にも負けねえからや
Over the course of the series, Callan comes to be infatuated first with Lelouch's identity of Zero, but eventually falls for the true man beneath it as well once she finally comes to understand him. And with her acting as Lelouch's initial in with the Japanese resistance, Callan's friends for her brother's resistance cell are also an active part in these events as the founding members of the Black Knights, which eventually grow to assimilate forces from the Japanese army Lelouch has connections to. But opposing them is Lelouch's entire extended family, the armies they command, and the Britannian nobility that loves this corrupt exploitive status quo they have built over the last 200 years, and want nothing to change, who will happily murder anyone that proposes such as they do not see it as wrong to oppress those different and lesser than them. Most principally being Lelouch's elder half-sister Cornelia, who had spent her entire life bathed in Britannia's elitist propaganda, which has twisted her own perceptions in tandem with the trauma of the V Britannia's loss, acting to advance Britannia's conquest of the world in belief it would bring them the unity and subservience required to secure her own full-blooded sister Euphemia's safety, regardless of the people it oppresses, essentially acting as an inverted persona parallel to Lelouch's own relationship with Nunnally.
わざとバグナラクを放置したのか他の国を侵略するために
一撃にバレ真の平和は絶対的な力によってもたらされる
Euphemia herself shares in this by unintentionally making things worse as well, when her own attempts at helping are shown to be nothing but short-sighted patches to a systemic problem she refuses to confront, that undermines actually resolving the entire issue at hand, despite her wanting a solution to it. Though even her protests in the end advance only her own desires and just her family's safety. She's just willing to be open to options that benefit more than just herself as well. And lastly, their elder half-brother Schneisel, who happens to be a nihilistic sociopathic madman who will burn everything to the ground in order to leave them all in a stagnant, unchanging present where everything about the existing system remains as it is, and will happily manipulate everyone and twist everything to make him the one with all the pieces on the board. And again, to compare to Lelouch in that, Schneisel's what happens if Lelouch were actually selfish and bereft of any sense of morality or ability to care for anyone else but himself, and is thus his purpose for existing in the story, to provide that contrast and opponent to be overcome. If you deliberately ignore the morality change and motivators Lelouch has, it is quite easy to mistake one for the other, which ties into the series' themes about morality, motivation, and objectivity with regards to how one perceives actions in war.
私は脅威とみなしたものは例外なく力で排除する君の国も何を
失礼蚊がいたもので
暴行罪ではないのかな
この程度で痛むのか
And this is on top of the machinations of their father, who wants to use the powers of Code and Geass to return everything to the past times before his current Britannia came about, because he has his mind overly fixated on reclaiming a lost past, regardless of how awful it was, and cares nothing about ruining any chance the world has at a future because of it, or even possibly fixing the mess the world is in solely because of his own selfishness, which he refuses to acknowledge or correct. Whose means of executing such tie themselves into the supernatural mythos arc, as Lelouch and CC are not the only ones with the powers of Code and Geass.
僕はあいつが許せない。王様は僕たち国民を守ってくれるんじゃないのか。守ってくれないなら戦うしかないんだよ。
But beyond them, Lelouch's first ever friend, Suzaku Kururugi, the son of Japan's former prime minister, is also his enemy, and the most dangerous one in the cast due to Lelouch's willful blind spots regarding him. As in the past, Suzaku killed his father and sold his country into Britannian slavery in the misguided belief he was saving lives. But in the story, the weight of this act and those that followed caused him to seek to repent for a screw-up by serving Britannia in hopes his people will see serving Britannia as slaves is the way to show their value as, well, humans, despite how idiotic that itself sounds, or he will die a warrior's death in absolution by those he most wronged killing him. But in doing so, it shows how little his morals and ideals mean anything if he just throw them away if he had a chance to claim something more important to him. Essentially, either absolution from his responsibilities, or just plain old power. For there is something that cannot be understated in any analysis of the series, and that is Suzaku is an absolute hypocrite when it comes to the contradictions in his own motivations. He believes that change can only come from being a slave to the very system that oppresses the people, and the system by design is made so as change cannot come from within, as power in the system is controlled from the top down. You can only enact change in such a system by replacing who runs it by acting against them. But the way Suzaku plays part in it protects those in power, while furthering their malice and oppression, and thus they become just as culpable, as the only way to move up in such a system is to show how corrupt you yourself are, and to be rewarded for it. You cannot claim morality while perpetuating a cycle maintained by conquest, oppression, and slavery. For in the entire history of the world, there has not been a single example of an oppressed people ever gaining their freedom back by being nice and willingly working for those that enslaved them. Not one. Those oppressed only get their freedom back by fighting for it and throwing off that yoke placed upon them. Thus, you come to realize his hypocrisy is not made contingent on a moral stance he constantly contradicts, but the position he stands for are themselves lies, disguising how he only truly cares about winning the argument with him in the right, and supports the side that gives him the image of that, no matter how much it is a lie. And thus, if Suzaku were the moral person that the story fails to frame him as, then he keeps making the same mistake and wrong choices in that he selfishly believes his way of doing things and what he values, which is demonstrably wrong, is the only right way to do anything. And his being right he considers more important than the well-being of others he claims to care for, as his acts to assert that his way is the only way that will work results in him denying the people Britannia has enslaved their freedoms, even assisting in their enslavement without care, which results in disastrous casualties as he doesn't understand that the Britannian nobility he blindly serves doesn't want to change and will not change for him. They'll just keep doing what they've always done since the founding of Britannia as a nation, and crush anyone who proposes that things should be different after using them up. And consequently, Suzaku blindly serving the subjugators only drives the body count higher, as better solutions that could give him what he wanted through differing means are subsequently lost, as he doesn't consider any path but his own as legitimate. Even as Suzaku makes clear he abdicates any moral high ground and his capacity to choose via his obedience to those he serves, who he knows are in the wrong. And in this way, Suzaku's motivations and end goal are no different than Schneisel's. The fighting will only end when a victor is determined, with the series coming to show how truly uncaring he is of how many bodies it shall take to reach that win condition, as long as it is gained his way, the way that puts him in the right of it all.
いつの間にか同じことを民に強いている。滑稽だな。
With the story's advancements eventually becoming motivated by solely Lelouch, Callan, and Suzaku's interwoven dynamics, with all three driving events in search of a better tomorrow, and the mistakes they make being ones that change the direction of the world. There is a lot I am not explaining with that synopsis of the series that is tied to its massive fall from grace and the hate-them that exists for certain parts of it. As the first season of the story, Code Geass R1, it was very well received. But in it, we can find the foundation of the problems the series and the franchise overall would develop. And there are a lot of them. So many, in fact, that no matter how long this review may end up being, this is still the short version of what I could have done. I have Word documents totaling up to, I kid you not, 1,000 pages of notes, partially written diatribes, snippets from other authors who've made comment or critique of the series, and previous ground-up revised drafts of this script. I've been working on this review for literally the last 5 years of my life, ever since the trash fire that is Lelouch of the Resurrection happened, only for delay after delay to come about in actually getting it, and the other reviews that will be associated with it, out. I am kind of grateful that some of those delays occurred, as it allowed me to gain access to new information we'd not had access to before, which recontextualized some of the details of the series and its production, as well as newer points of contrast that differently highlighted the same grievances the audience for the show developed against it, and what Sunrise did to it. For unfortunately, sometimes the writer only knows how to deliver what they think the audience wants, or just what solely the writer wants, and not what the audience actually would want. And this can be true of producers, directors, editors, hell, even executives who may come in to meddle in things as well, all of whom can make a mess of a production by going against what an audience most engages with in a tale. Code Geass is very much a victim of that mentality, as what the writer wanted out of the series ended up different than the director, which was different from the studio, and all that in diametric opposition to what the audience itself would accept, which we have still not gotten to this day. A not insignificant part of that being half the story is not actually in the original anime. There are tie-in audio dramas which are canon.
自分で調べられる。知りたいのは校舎の配置と施設の詳細だ。
それは調べられないの？
その手の情報はテロの格好の資料になるから非公開。なんだ。学園長の孫のくせにそんなことも知らないのか？敷地は石畳、ところどころにギャップがあるな。校舎への出入りは階段、スロープと手すりも必要か？
座ったままで失礼します。足と目が不自由なものですから。
そう。それで手すりとかって。
わかったろ。
There are picture dramas, which are included in the bonus features of the DVDs and Blu-rays, which are canon.
人殺し！お父さんを返して！あなたが殺したんでしょ！
お父さんって
私たちの国を守るために戦ったの！お兄ちゃんも、おじさんも、みんな！どうして殺したの？お父さんもお兄ちゃんも優しかったのに！鬼！悪魔！
And there are light novels, which are canon. I tossed up a snippet, but we didn't get those. And that's on top of manga series that retell the story absent certain key details, and ones that are official side stories that once more fill in missing information, before you even get into stuff that is officially just alternate continuities. Stuff that just plain rewrite the story to its worst possible interpretation, or otherwise attempt to expand more on the original tale than the anime medium allowed, that are unfortunately non-canon. The main Code Geass anime series, as consequence of this, is in fact a skeleton of a structure with significant chunks torn out of it that would properly support the foundation of what is built atop that, as they lack the proper time to give attention to everything that was needed to tell the story properly from beginning to end to define its ultimate direction, and at times deliberately did not have necessary, critical, need-to-know information to either the characters or the audience, for the intentional reason that providing such need-to-know information would entirely subvert the ultimate direction of the series, which is not a good thing any way around. And thus the series becomes overwhelmingly reliant on paratext, that being information supplied about the show from sources that are not the show itself, to put everything into proper perspective with what was meant. As, oh my yes, do many people who watch Code Geass get the wrong ideas about what was intended because the story itself is not self-contained, some of which was directly Sunrise's fault in forcing critical story information out of the series to make decisions in it more ambiguous, as they knew not everyone would engage with the extra canonical material to know about what was meant.
物語の読み方から教えてあげよう。すべての事柄はつながっているが、すべては書かれていない。だからこそ自分で想像しながら道中のワクワクを楽しむのさ。例えばここに至るまでにずっと気になってたことがあったら、それを大切に読んでみるといい。
With R1, it can be enjoyed on its own, but only up to a point. As the farther the franchise moved along, the more developed baggage it could just not reconcile without that time material, or what was deliberately not written in. And yet at the same time, that material likewise would show where the story was going wrong, and improperly spending the focus of its direction, because the writer became so fixated on the ending, and Sunrise itself didn't allow the time or the events that would have potentially allowed the ending to be properly built up to, and in context, work. As just even a minor look into that extra canonical information allows one to see the fraying net that eventually would result in the vastly more controversial second season, Code Geass R2, the OVA series Akito the Exiled, which had such deep mixed reception to it that Sunrise should have taken it as the warning sign that it was, and the compilation movie timeline that only served to completely break the camel's back by contradicting the reasoning for actions provided previously that, despite being canon, are excised from the film to entirely reimagine the storyline, and to its complete detriment. At the time of recording this, Sunrise is about to release the newest entry in the franchise, Rose of the Recapture, and that series is said to just inherit all of the baggage left behind by Sunrise's previous executive meddling nonsense that turned what could have been something truly special into a mess that they refused to properly resolve. And before anyone asks, I still refer to Sunrise as Sunrise and not the retitled name of Bandai Namco Studios. And it is for a key reason. For there is misconduct the studio is long noted for across their various intellectual properties that have done wrong by them, and they were performed by solely Sunrise executives, not Bandai ones. Bandai, however, gets blamed for so many of them, because Sunrise director Yoshi Kitamino liked to blame the sponsors of his productions anytime someone would tell him no over a creative decision of his, even when that no would come from Sunrise internally. So very many people took his word as gospel, leading to deep misconceptions about what Bandai itself actually would intercede on, which would usually be in the developmental stage of a series, or what would come from Sunrise itself, which is usually changes to story events in the midst of production. But because of this rename, it is now difficult to distinguish the two entities and what bad decisions and mandates came from where, unless you follow from the older patterns of misconduct. And this does factor into analysis of Code Geass because according to the show's creative staff, a number of things people hate about the franchise were the result of mandates made by Sunrise. As according to them, Sunrise had no faith in the show the way the show was originally going to be made, and the canonical side content problem acted as one of the symptoms of a larger problem Sunrise itself created, as the later media produced for the franchise intentionally and outright ignores all of it, deeming that content and context it provides unimportant despite it directly informing the story being told and the actions within it, as was what was the originally intended canonical romance of the series, Sunrise did not want to let them follow through on. Which is where we should actually discuss the men most responsible for the series. Director Goro Taniguchi and writer Ichiro Okouchi. Goro Taniguchi is sort of the easier name to talk about in all this, as he's been around a long time, beginning in the anime industry as a storyboard artist and background production worker in 1991 on the anime Zettai Muteki Raijin O. He would be a supporting and episode director on several Sunrise series to follow, including Gundam's G, Wing, and X, as well as King of Braves Gao Gaigar. But it was with his proper independent directorial debut that he first got major attention on him, that being the 1998 One Piece OVA, Defeat the Pirate Ganzak, a pilot anime production for the eventual One Piece anime series produced not long after the One Piece manga had entered production in 1997. This thus making sense why, decades later, Taniguchi would be called upon again by One Piece's creator Eiichiro Oda to direct the movie that served as the series' 25th anniversary event, Film Red. But that's later down the line. For the Ganzak OVA, it was more recognized that Taniguchi was at the point where he could hold down his own series as a head director, and had eyes for both staging grandiose fights as well as subtle storytelling, knowing to add in minor character tics and nuances to the artistry to inform a character not just through words, but actions, all of which allows works he is on to normally generate larger, far more impactful payoffs. This first seen with his series Infinite Ryvius, which he partnered with writer Yosuke Kuroda to make in 1999. I have, unfortunately, never had a chance to see Ryvius, but from what I've been told, it was a successful enough series, one that allowed the pair to partner again for one that I am far more familiar with. Yosuke Kuroda, for those who don't know him, is actually behind a number of successful series and adaptations, including the original Trigun anime and Hellsing Ultimate, Excel Saga, Honey and Clover, and to stuff as recently as Sunrise's Birdie Wing series. He's also been the primary adapter of scripts for My Hero Academia's anime, and the primary scribe for most of the Tenchi Muyo anime series, both TV and OVA incarnations alike. The good ones, at any rate. It is rare I actually actively dislike something from that man. And some have wondered what a Code Geass series might have been like had he been the one to write the series instead. And you really shouldn't, as he already did it. That show is called Mobile Suit Gundam 00. But through Kuroda, Taniguchi gained connection to Hideyuki Kurata, who by 2003 had become a member of Studio Orphe, a writers' creative group Kuroda had founded. Taniguchi and Kurata then collaborated in producing his series Gunsword with Studio AIC Asta, it bearing several elements that left it directly in parallel with Taniguchi's prior work on Scride, with the protagonist being an effective outlaw righting wrongs that were in their sight while seeking out the sources of greater malice corrupting and screwing over the free lives of people.
自分を曲げたお前にはもう二度とラッキーはやらない。
Both Scride's Kazuma and Gunsword's Vaughn being individuals who are so reserved that people get the wrong ideas of them, but seek acceptance for the truth of themselves, and fighting for worlds where they can just be free and happy with those they care about. It's just in Vaughn's case he's more on a vengeance quest than Kazuma started out in the series, because the central villain of the Gunsword, the Claw, murdered the woman who gave that piece to Vaughn, and multiple others throughout the story. And while Scride had this as a more overt theme to its narrative being about rebellion, complete with an antagonist-turned-rival character in both which the respective men sought to stop through dueling means, it was in Gunsword that allowed more exploration and establishment of a running setting to explore such concepts of what it means to be free and how one can unknowingly become enslaved to destructive doctrine and actual monsters. As Vaughn traveled to find the villain he sought, with Vaughn's own rebellion being against the ideals of a man that believes he can bring about true peace and prosperity only through sacrifice and enslavement of people's very minds and existence into one amalgamated will, and those who foolishly and blindly follow that absurdity. With Vaughn guided through that campaign which risked destruction of his very self, not through blind hate, nor through rage, but one emotion alone that bursts through every pore of his being.
でも今の俺はお前が手伝ってくれたおかげなんだよな。お前はもう俺の中にしかいない。
Sprite and Gunsword are absolutely fantastic series from Taniguchi, both of which I recommend, as they're certainly examples of his directorial style fully gelling with the screenwriters he was working with, and in line with the budgets the studios could afford. Whereas when he's done other higher budget things, I'm not the biggest fan of One Piece Film Red, despite Kaoru Nausicaa being perfect casting for a girl whose wistfully naive ideology threatens to crush the world and break the people she claims to cherish. And for his series Back Arrow he did with writer Kazuki Nakashima, well, I guess the show's big twist ending with the first episode, and I feel Taniguchi did not work well with Nakashima to fulfill what plans they had for it. It was a major step down from the highs Nakashima usually hits for me as well. But it is also with Gunsword where we see that Taniguchi began to stray into bad habits that would define the rest of his career. Taniguchi has a problem with sexualizing characters that have no reason to be sexualized. Either their sexuality is not a big part of their characters, they are personally uncomfortable presenting their sexuality either publicly or to a person of interest, or they happen to be underage, thrown up as pandering fan service. Now to be clear, there is not necessarily something wrong with presenting a character as sexually open or curious or presenting attraction. This is going to differ between series and characters depending on what the focus of their stories is, which makes it more egregious in some, but not so in others. Sometimes that is a way that individuals are made to express and show affection. They are learning about and becoming more comfortable with themselves. Or it can be a personality trait where they feel proud of their body, have confidence in their looks, and have no inhibitions about showing it off. This is applying equally to both men and women where it can be a character trait and not the entirety of the character themselves. Taniguchi's problem is, he takes it too far with characters he should not be, and Gunsword is arguably the first signs of that, where some cast members devolve to being used as nothing but fan service, or sexual fan service is used improperly with them, as is not on their terms. This does not make Gunsword a bad series, and only reaches the point of being egregious in one episode, where such is ultimately played for laughs. But it is one of its faults Taniguchi caused for it. And in later series, he would start to treat women in the cast more as eye candy or sex dolls at times, doing sexually teasing acts for no other reason than to draw male gaze in ways that aren't justifiable without some factor of mitigation the story does not within itself provide. Now, some would say in counter-argument that this is not necessarily all Taniguchi's doing, as in fact the chief animation director on both Gunsword and Code Geass was a different man. The late, great Takehiro Kimura, who passed away sadly in 2023. Kimura is also known for his work as an animator and character designer on G Gundam and King-Ohger, where he previously worked with Taniguchi to build a rapport with the other man. And Kimura himself does have a tendency towards sexualized fan service in his own distinct work as well. The difference, however, is no matter what project he worked on, such tended to feel right for the moments and setting and not out of place as came to be observed about Taniguchi's works. Though also worth noting, the character designs themselves on Code Geass came neither from Kimura or Taniguchi, but the artists of manga studio Clamp. And Kimura's series, Shinkan Gatai Godaner, while one of the more egregious in presenting characters with exaggerated proportions, inevitably tells a story that has as its grounding a story about mature relationships, with those at the core of it a pair of newlyweds trying to figure out what the next step in their life is. So the sexuality on display in the series has a sense to it when taken in those terms, even though the fan service at times is likewise just played for laughs. That everyone in that series is to some degree portrayed as being an absurdity makes such acts as more a background element as everyone gets it equally, as opposed to something irritatingly shoved to the forefront by singling out characters that do not like or want to be sexualized, and in a setting that is not overtly sexualized, to then be sexualized. For that is Taniguchi's issue. It has been one that has remained even when Kimura retired from regular animation and art design work, thus cannot be blamed on him. Kimura's last work before his death was designing the character Perun in Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and one that, while Taniguchi has attempted to remedy it, still pops up on occasion where he does not take the steps he should to find a means of validating why a character ends up in provocative positions or dress. One of the ways that could have validated it being that the character makes clear in the media itself that they don't experience sexual attraction, thus do not get the connotations of their exposure as a result. And another, more common case is the tease was being presented to show attraction between the two characters, or as a setup to them being seen in the light of a paramour. But if you do not do that, or are not being allowed to follow it up in that context so it is building to that moment of mutual attraction and acceptance of those feelings, well, you get how Callan ends up denigrated in Code Geass' movie timeline, where it could have been justified with just a simple change that they were not allowed to do, while so overtly sexualizing her despite her previously showing discomfort from those acts. And in this case, not exactly helped by the merchandise, as you can see from here. Yeah, the only figures of Callan that are actually put on the market are all those that are very fan servicey. I actually got these to make that specific point that I can't find one of her being the action girl when she is actually the action girl of the series. Which is where Ichiro Okouchi himself comes into play. And poor Ichiro Okouchi, as he is certainly among a list of writers that has been screwed over by Sunrise every time he has worked with them. It was actually only because of Gundam the Witch from Mercury that I determined a good perspective on his career. For as nice as that series was, many of the same failings Code Geass bears were also present in that series, including Sunrise going out of their way to once again screw with one of his intended relationship arcs that he had laid out from the series literally from their first episode. And yes, again, it does not surprise me Okouchi is not currently working with Sunrise on the Rose series, as the mess that happened with G-Witch was the third consecutive time they had done that to him. I'm not kidding on this, and this is why I still consider Sunrise separate from Bandai itself, because, yeah, Bandai was on board shipping G-Witch's main characters Soletta Mercury and Niarete Rembrandt, even though they're girls, and it produced a lot of merchandise for the series which directly revolved around them being gay for each other. That it makes no sense for Bandai to be the one to pull the plug on it, and for them to release press statements that the two's relationship was supposed to be ambiguous and open to interpretation. And this has happened repeatedly before with Sunrise. Bandai even gave the G-Witch production staff additional funding for the release of the Blu-rays to allow them to make this more overt that they ended up together at the end, as they'd gone through this song and dance with Sunrise executives before, where the supplementary additions would have to undo their stupid mistakes. This is again what I meant about having to follow the pattern of Sunrise's misconduct divorced from Bandai itself. As again, this was the third incident with just Okouchi. This had been a matter mishandled before in Gundam 00, where Kuroda had spoken out about not being able to show Setsuna FCA and felt Grace develop an attraction to each other in the second season to quantify that they were not shipping Setsuna with Marina Ismail. or Gundam Seed and Destiny, where they weren't allowed to be as overt as they wanted to be about the multiple romance arcs in that series either. Hell, this stretches back to at least Gundam Wing as well. And the 2014 anime Cross-Ange had to perform a legitimate fake-out with the main characters' paramours to make the executives not pay attention to the hat trick they were in turn pulling. Sunrise keeps doing this, and it needs to be called out. But why it was more difficult to determine Okouchi's writing quirks is the man has not written a lot of original works. The most he is credited as working on anime, it's adaptational work from manga, such as his recent job on the second season of Spy Family, alongside writing their movie Code White, or further back to Angelic Layer and Mahou Sensei Nigima. His earliest writing work is actually in novels, him writing the novelization of Revolutionary Girl Utena in 1998, and 3 novels based off of Mobile Suit Gundam the 8th MS Team in 1999. Those later novels, however, are how he caught the attention of Yoshiyuki Tomino, bringing him on from writing books for Gundam into anime screenplays on the series Turn A Gundam. And Tomino would call on him again for his first original head writer credits on an anime series, Overman King-Ohger.
Do the monkey with me! Come on!
Yeah, Okouchi's origins as a novelist and his first anime works being under Tomino pretty much put everything into perspective with regards to his shortcomings as an anime writer, independent of whatever Sunrise did to screw with the shows, and whatever Taniguchi might himself be responsible for. For as is the constant critique of Okouchi's body of work, it consistently feels like we are being denied critical, need-to-know information, because there is not enough time in each episode, nor the series itself, to provide time and focus on everything necessary to tell the story correctly, in comparison to all the details that will be permitted to one in novelized form. And Tomino, infamously, is not good at training new talent. He relies instead on the inexperienced, so he gets to tell the story his own way. As when Tomino alone is the writer on a project, it's quite bad. And the director and animators adding in visual cues and actions through storyboarding the narrative can only help so much without the words there to provide the proper context to the actions performed.
謎を解く鍵は全て行間に物語の狭間に隠したわからんなぜだ舞さん方ってのはどうして見えないものを見ようとしないんだ
And Okouchi's emphasis in anime scripts are centrally upon plot essential elements, stripping down the expanded narrative of a novel into a bare-bones structure needed, with too much then left to the audience to connect. For most writers, story happens because of character, whereas in most of Okouchi's works, plot happen regardless of character, and characterization happens to be just something that happens along the way due to certain characters needing to fill certain roles. But that's how characterization at times in his stories can end up lacking or straight up disregarded if it services the plot, and audiences won't agree with such if it's established that such characters wouldn't do what they're made to do, or should have had focused attention to justify what is done. And that doesn't mean that he doesn't work to backfill in essential details and information once the structure is there, or didn't intend direction for the characters to move in to fulfill the story's goals, but one certainly finds greater emphasis on the plot overall else in his work than others. And he isn't necessarily bad at romance arcs either, but if there isn't the time to provide that evidence for a paramour arc, he won't add it in. An example of this, I actually adore how he wrote Arsene Lupin and Fujiko Mine's dynamic in the storyline of Lupin III Part 5. Two people that do have genuine affections for each other, but the nature of who they are means that their relationship is so very much founded upon the chase. Fujiko believing Lupin only values her as the world's greatest treasure he can never have, and Lupin believing no showcase of trust in her will ever allow her to accept his affections unless he first gives up on trying to claim her heart, which he can never do. This being so well seated throughout the narrative arc and character stories of Part 5, that their ultimate culmination at the climax of that series was so very poignant, so very beautiful, and so very Lupin.
You want me to answer the question from way back when?
Yes, I do, Lupin. What am I to you anyway?
I, too, have been thinking about it. about a lot of stuff since you asked me that. But after spending time to think it through, this is the best answer I could come up with.
That is a series where the two who very clearly love each other can never be together due to factors outside of any creative's control. That is just who they are. And yet it is accepted by the fandom of Lupin because we have enough overwhelming information to understand how they really feel. And Okouchi perfectly nails that delivery because it is built on something pre-existent. It is established from the start of the show their dynamic in relation to one another is important, and it is touched on in those terms throughout the show. So, yeah, contrary to criticism of his works, Okouchi can write romance. Because that was romance. It is in the little moments, the gestures, the downtime between them where that is forged and based. It's just his works sacrifice those little moments if they're not plot essential, as he won't make the time for them. Thus why they're frequently shoved off into the Paratext.
やれやれ。行間の読めない連中と話すのは疲れる。
But even then, his staging and structure of his tales, when they have not been screwed with, is actually fantastic with how many narrative points are chained together so closely into a grander tapestry or chained net. Or at least there up until the point you come to realize that what keeps being cut out really is essential to informing those story points, to say nothing on the proper passage of time that would allow them all to naturally occur and move in the direction the narrative needs them to. So the structure is there. The supports are there. It looks to be a complete production. But then you start looking at the fine details and find the bolts securing the supports together are loose or missing, leading to the supports buckling and the built structure just completely failing. And all because not enough time is permitted for characters to be characters to secure the supports organically. Because the story comes from character and not the other way around, yet the reverse is consistently true with Okouchi. And thanks to this overt emphasis on pushing to the forefront narrative over character, characterization constantly suffers with him. And while it isn't necessarily setting-breaking as important character information can be gained from the plots they play part of, it is something that starts to add up and make an audience not be on board the creative decisions that are made, because inevitably a character that is left to the whims of solely plot points will be made to do things out of presented character, or the character we needed to be presented has itself been left on the cutting room floor in the worst cases to have a perception of him that is diametrically opposed against what they are made to do. While the story will continue to insist, it is then natural for them to do what was needed, and the viewers will consequently disagree. And this is not always his fault. He gets denied the time needed, the directors he's working with can misconstrue an idea and direction had, or someone above them can and has executive meddle to mess things up. And especially in Code Geass' case, where Okouchi did not write every episode. He had secondary writers supporting his own efforts which did not necessarily all agree with the intended direction and what needed to be shown and emphasized. But this would not happen so commonly with him if he was putting everything required to be in the story as part of it in the first place. You can only excuse it happening so much and so many times, and I do feel his works are worse off for how reliant they are on extra-canonical knowledge to properly understand what their intent was. And consequently, there will always be someone who has never heard of or engaged with that side material who will take away the wrong ideas. And Code Geass of Okouchi's body of work is the biggest victim of that, as even telling people secondhand will not get across the same point. I've brought up a few examples of this in the series Biopsy already. To back up a bit to G-Witch, this was seen most centrally with the character of Miorine Rembrandt, who comes off to the audience as someone cold, distant, reserved, and demanding. Or as my roommate John put it, she's season 1 Weiss from Ruby. We are not allowed proper time and insight into her head over that of title character Suletta Mercury, especially as the series is supposed to be equally about both of them and the evolution of their relationship, from the engagement of convenience to business partners, to sharing actual affection and the road bumps amidst that, which can have each of them get the wrong impression of the other, which they need to work through. But we don't see focused attention paid to downtime with them, or even something that resembles a proper date to properly build that affection, because the story arc and giving narrative details is more important than character moments between them, even though some still are allowed to slip in. But even Suletta visiting Mirene's room in private time between the two of them is more there for plot reasons, used to showcase how Mirene, despite her attempts to be independent from her father, is not functioning well herself as an individual due to the pressure she is under to maintain her own agency. Though while she can look after and be responsible for others, she is failing to do so for herself because she has no one looking out for her, and that being a role Suletta herself can choose to serve, so they may enter into mutually beneficial interactions. And that might be all easily inferred character information, but the way G-Witch treats the delivery of that material is as a series of plot points with incidental information revealed about a character, not as character moments themselves. And that is because the anime medium, especially in Okouchi's works for Sunrise, do not allow him the time to convey all of that needed information in the way a novel would. And so, it has to go off into spin-off material, because despite how essential and important it is to relating the story correctly, there wasn't the time for it. Another case in point on this, one of the ways that Sunrise used to discredit the idea that Suletta and Mirene were a couple is because it was never said what their sexuality was. Except it was.
そして、私の婚約者の証でもあるわ。言ったでしょ、そういうルールだって。でも私、女ですけど。水星ってお堅いのね。こっちじゃ全然ありよ。
Yeah, for those who don't know, Mirene was confirmed to be a lesbian in G-Witch's tie-in novels, where it is explained that the animosity she has with her father is all based from how Mia was in a relationship with another girl, and her father caused them to break up when her dad instituted a competition for her hand in marriage, the children of rival and related corporations to the Rembrandts' own vying for that engagement in order to gain the financial power the Rembrandts had. She was turned into an object without agency to be won. Mirene's conflict with and hatred towards her father is all contingent on that, as is her animosity towards those vying for her hand, who consider her naught but that prize instead of as a person. Especially this asshole. As it's this asshole that makes Mirene distrust those around her and expect anyone and everyone to be out for their own agendas. And the people she meets are secretly not who they present themselves as being. Like, that's a running thing throughout the show she keeps asserting. What you think is just her being distrustful and bratty, that is given critical context in the side story that it comes from experience. And Suletta, when she by accident stumbles into all this, was her means of escape, as well as a new relationship she could cultivate and grow that wouldn't be so easily taken from her. Specifically because Suletta was honest and presented herself as being nothing more than who she was. That is all important, need-to-know context that is all character-based, which all informs the major story points and the direction the story thusly moves in. But it was deemed unimportant to be put as part of the main storyline. So it got shoved off into time material not everyone is going to know exists. Especially international viewers, which won't have access to everything the Japanese audience will. Okouchi's work is overwhelmingly like this. And because we didn't have context to this at the time, and not everyone learned of it when the show was airing, several events were not taken well as they happened in the simulcast of the series. Such as Mirene's rushed confession of true affection,
だから逃げたかったのに、地球に行きたかったのに、バカみたいに進めば2つって言うから。会社作る羽目になってクソ親父にチクチク小言言われて頭下げて、よかったって言ってんの。私が逃げなくてよくなったのはあんたのおかげなの。だから私から逃げないでよ。任せてください。ずっとそばにいて。はい、いません。信じません。私花婿ですから。
And the following pulling of the rug that happens after to defeat that moment.
やめなさい。閉まらないな。助けに来たよ、ミオリネさん。笑ってるの。人殺し。
I remember so many people during G-Witch's airing that got mad at that mid-season cliffhanger, writing off the show from that point onwards as it was the step too far to openly give such affection and then snatch it back immediately after. As if to say, yes, that affection had conditions attached to it. Even when her paramour had only done what she was being condemned for to save her life. And as a screw-up, Okouchi could not deny, admitted flat out, and made overtures to focus on Mio regretting what she did, allowing the character to grow from that mistake and show more overtly how interactions with Suletta had changed her and brought light back to her life, which could have been smoothed over from the outset if we had this character information up front. So, what if, instead of calling her fiancé a monster, Mio had just ended the cliffhanger by screaming in anguish and hysteria, such caused by the realization that even Suletta had a secretive dark side and broken bit of her she'd never been allowed to see. That outcry being part of that revelation that Suletta wasn't being entirely honest with her either, just as all the other people she had rejected had been. That gets the point across without condemning the character. For what the scene was supposed to do in context was to show how psychologically dependent Suletta had been made by her mother, and how her mother gaslit her actions into obeying her without thought, making it so Suletta had no independent wants or needs or life, and the attachment to Mio was the only thing she had that was hers, resultantly contextualizing that dark side to her. This event done to lead into the second half of the show that was supposed to be more focused on how toxic a relationship they both had with their parents that used both of them for their own whims, and the need to not become like them. But the show couldn't shift that paradigm immediately without further compounding the character problem it had created for itself, because it had failed to build the proper groundwork in non-story arc-focused character expository episodes to justify this turn. As the thing is, in anime production, if you're not adapting a light novel or manga, you don't get those anymore, as they are written off as solely filler content. But character-focused stories aren't filler content. Filler content is a tale that does nothing for the story but fill a runtime. You can have a tale that might not focus on the main plot, but still do good things for the cast involved.
歯車が一つでも欠けたら城は動かなかった。誰一人欠けてもシュゴッダムは守られなかった。みんなの力だ。ありがとう。
And this isn't the first time such an act was a step too far with audiences who didn't have access to the full context. Code Geass had this happen as well, with its mid-season cliffhanger almost verbatim. But ultimately, while I criticize G-Witch for screwing this up, and not permitting focus on the downtime it needs to establish them as a proper couple, I am still behind them being together, and consider the show to be a good one. because the series acknowledged the screw-ups and used it to its advantage to progress an arc about their reconciliation in the back half of it, to show that relationships are complicated and they need work and communication to be maintained. For the actual narrative beats of their arc, I've seen them before. Most people have.
彼、全てが終わったら一緒にアッシュフォード学院に帰らないか。
あんたと同じよ。私もなくしたくないの。大切なものを。
答えてるルージュ。あなたにとって私は何？
ゲームだったんだよ、これは。
そう。さよなら、ルルージュ。
彼、君は生きろ。
ずっと隣にいたいって。今度は私から言わなくちゃって。一緒に指輪買って式も挙げて二人とも最高のドレス着て。ごめんね。ごめんなさい。私あり突然動かなくなっちゃって。知ってる。どうして？あんたに負けて欲しかったからよ。さようなら。水星のおのぼりさん。
As oh my yes, the entire length of G-Witch, Code Geass viewers were getting flashbacks to just everything. Everything regarding how Okouchi wrote Lelouch and Cal's respective dynamics, because that was the ship he intended to be portrayed in Code Geass. Their arcs were different, but you can see every major cast member in Code Geass represented in a different character in G-Witch. With exception to one that Sunrise mandated be in the show to begin with that acted as nothing but a story device in that tale. But why G-Witch adds context that might be lost on others is in fact that, like Okouchi's early novels, G-Witch and Code Geass as well act as transliteral adaptations of other works. In specific, Okouchi borrows from the narrative arcs of the works of the bard himself, William Shakespeare. And he does it a lot. G-Witch is overwhelmingly influenced in its narrative arc by Shakespeare's 1610 play, The Tempest. In fact, two key Gundams of G-Witch are named after Ariel and Caliban from that play, as an overt nod to the tale. Suletta taking up the role of the character Ferdinand, while Miorine herself embodies the role of Miranda, with the two in the play having a romance arc that ends with the two married as the spirit of Ariel, bound to the service of Ferdinand's parent, is in turn sent free by their union. So by G-Witch adapting the plot of The Tempest in both big and small ways, it even more greatly spotlit how Sunrise had gone out of their way to screw with the series ending. For by being an adaptation, that ending of Suletta and Miorine being together and married was preordained from the start. And Okouchi made it so obvious from the outset that he was shipping the two to cover his bases because his intended romance arcs had been screwed over before. And by this point, he is well aware of his shortcomings as a writer and what will happen if he is not as direct as he can be, even if he still has to put character stuff inside content. Because his plans will be misunderstood or screwed over by the higher-ups otherwise. That, more than anything, clued people still oblivious to Sunrise's misconduct towards intended romance arcs in their series, and their mandates to make them unnecessarily ambiguous. And how they have in the past rewritten the ending of characters and the narrative around them against the wishes of the actual creative staff. And again, this is the third documented time they did this to Okouchi, and he's only been credited on 4 projects with them as their head writer. But as I said, it is unsurprising everything ended up like this, considering again, Overman King-Ohger.
Do the monkey with me! Come on!
And yeah, I skipped around that for a reason. King-Ohger is a mess! I literally could not sit through the series because, well, admittedly I am not a fan of Tomino's storytelling. I feel his best works are better off credited to their actual writers whose recurring tropes don't irritate me, and Tomino has this horrible habit of not only making mischaracterization the point in his series, but leaving out essential details needed to tell the story in context of the world it is set in. But unlike Okouchi, he does not place that information anywhere that would be accessible. In essence, what we know now as Okouchi's writing shortcomings are ones Tomino only exasperates. Like, I do the monkey joke over the show's opening credits, but that's basically the joke of the show. Those characters dancing are doing so to distract from a text crawl that would actually explain what the hell is going on in the show. But that distraction prevents us from learning it while taunting us over it. If you're actually curious, King-Ohger is a very loose adaptation of The Ice Company, a series of science fiction novels written by French writer Georges Jean Arnaud, set in a post-apocalyptic version of Earth that was devastated and frozen over by the rampant abilities of the Overmen, the mecha units of the series, which all have special abilities tied to them. Who built them? How were such powers developed? In what ways did they go out of control to result in all this? Those questions the series treat as less essential. But in the eternal storm left in its wake, people have been forced to live in sheltered city-states for their own safety and well-being. When a contingent of one city decides to perform an exodus to another city-state, the young teenager Gain is drawn into the forced separation because he's an asshole, only to find the people seeking exodus are also assholes and he wants nothing to do with them. But for some imbecilic reason, he can't go back to his home and just abandon these assholes to their deaths in the frozen overworld, which is still infested by other malicious and rampant Overman robots and those who survive outside the domes. And why can't Gain go back or stay on other settlements they encounter, beyond the leadership of a city-state also being complete assholes? I could absolutely not tell you. Like, genuinely, this is one of the absolute worst told works Tomino has ever brought to the world, only topped by Victory Gundam and the series that Tomino wrote himself. I know Tomino is not necessarily a bad person, but he is known to be myopic towards his own shortcomings and can say improper and disrespectful things off the cuff that can make him act as an antagonist towards others in the anime industry. And I generally believe he used Okouchi's inexperience to push doing a lot of the show his way and how they adapted the Ice Company source material. As more is told to you about the show from watching interviews and commentaries for the series, or from reading the original source material itself, than is being given in the actual main narrative. I learned more about what the show was supposed to be about from the Wikipedia page for the series than was actually told in the anime itself. Hell, I have old issues of New Type magazine that told me more about what the show was supposed to be about than the show itself actually explained. The series frustrates me because it keeps raising questions it refuses to give answers to, and the only places to find them are in interviews that have been lost to time unless you hoard old magazines. Which again ties back to that problem of you need to engage with supplementary material. Only in this case, no supplementary material actually exists. And you know, it's funny, as before watching it, I'd been told that this was supposed to be a lost Tomino classic. And even the back of the DVD case from the original Anime Legends DVDs says that itself, but no. The only thing this series seemed to in any way succeed in was pull money away from the production of Gundam Seed. Tomino got King-Ohger greenlit for production in advance of Seed itself, despite Seed's longer planned development time. And thus for it, they got to pick the premium animation staff at the company in the midst of their changeover to digital animation, meaning the more experienced members of the staff with the tech were working with him, while Seed got more of Sunrise's newer talent, and a higher animation budget purportedly granted to Tomino's 26-episode tier series than the 50-episode tentpole that would actually prove itself to earn Sunrise all of the money. Like, this isn't the only case of this, which drew into question Tomino actually giving Seed's producer, Mitsuo Fukada, his blessing and assortment of plot ideas, even though Tomino wanted Gundam as a franchise to end at turn A, and Fukada couldn't use Tomino's suggestions, as he wasn't making a UC Gundam series. But it drew his blessing into question because, well, during the entire time the Seed series were in production, Tomino was drawing production assets away from them. If not to other Gundam projects like MS Igloo and Evolve, then it was to his Zeta Gundam A New Translation project. And even before that, Gainer itself was doing so. From an outside perspective, it does look like he was trying to sabotage them, especially due to the generally poor storytelling through most of these productions. I have unreliable metrics on what the actual animation budget for Gainer was, so I'm not going to throw them on screen, and feel free to take my next statement with as much salt as you wish. But the ones I have seen are quoting that they were receiving anywhere from twice as much per episode as Gundam Seed was, to twice as much money as the entire Seed season cost to animate. I cannot say that is for certain factual, but it definitely looks like they did. The contrast is that striking. Even though the actual visual storytelling is a mess, and the actual dialogue for the series is quite terrible. But the thing is, Gainer is still an influential work in Okouchi's career. He has referenced things he did here, or lifted wholesale stories he did for King-Ohger in his later works. Case in point on that, the 17th episode for the series has as its title a phrase Code Geass fans are intimately aware of. The world without lies. Gee, I wonder if that will at all be relevant. But it is also one that almost doomed Okouchi's career. As is revealed in an interview Goro Taniguchi did, when he was first put on the project that would become Code Geass, Taniguchi had deep reservations about potentially working with Okouchi on it. He had seen King Gainer himself and considered the series, like many, to be an incoherent mess. Not just from the perspective of the final product, but even the storyboarding for the series he could not wrap his head around, despite Taniguchi starting out as a storyboard artist helping plot the directions of a tale. He was not interested in working with Okouchi as a result, and wanted to see if he could swap him out with Kuroda or Kurata due to his previous successes with the two, and wasn't sure the same would result in partnering with Okouchi. This only changed when Taniguchi actually met Okouchi, and when Taniguchi asked about Gainer and the coherence of the storyboards, Okouchi revealed that the ones Taniguchi could not make sense of were all ones Yoshuki Tamino did solely himself, without any input from Okouchi. The man shared storyboards he himself did for those same plots, which were not used in the series, and for there Taniguchi actually could understand what was intended. It was realized Tamino had only facilitated Okouchi to embrace his worst writing faults and impulses during the prior production, and they purportedly got along from there. And it's not the only thing that cross-pollinated as a consequence. To say the show is meritless would be a lie, as there are some decent standalone episodes in there where Okouchi is cited as taking the wheel away from Tamino and running with it. If you can get past the complete failure to properly establish the world setting, status quo, and why we should actually be invested in the cast inside of the show itself. As the screw-up there put me against the show from the outset. And that appears to be a common issue with the series for others as well. It is definitely a Tamino series in the worst meanings of the term, and not one embraced by audiences at the time. Again, I cite these old issues of New Type, and Gainer literally got destroyed in 2002 because it did not get people on board the show. Like, if Gainer was meant to compete with Gundam Seed, it was not even a contest. Seed was the single most successful series Sunrise made for years.
Et boot.
While Gainer is barely a blip on the radar of early 2000s anime, even disregarding the utter juggernauts that were Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters, Pokemon Advanced, Detective Conan, and One Piece. It lost to Digimon Frontier, lost to Galaxy Angel, lost to Beyblade, lost to Kitty Grade, and if the numbers I have are accurate, it had lower viewership than fucking Mouse. I could go on listing more 2002 series that had more viewership than it, but I think the most poignant thing was Gainer lost to the man that would in turn portray the protagonist in Okouchi's next original work, who had been cast in a Masami Obari anime. For Gainer lost to the series named Gravion. And Gravion is, well, as MST3K put it,
it's breastical, bubical, chestical, mamical, pendular, globular, fun.
Flashical, orbital, moundula, scupula?
Righto, that's the one.
Yeah, again, it's a Masami Obari anime. And if there are three things Obari knows how to do, it is to make really cool looking robots, very awesome action scenes, and very attractive people with character appropriate sexual overtones. And at times, very unsubtle homoeroticism. As yes, Obari is an equal opportunity provider of fan service. That is why he gets away with it. In Gravion, main character Eiji Shigure is investigating the disappearance of his sister, leading to him to the castle of an individual known as Sandman. Sandman is in fact an alien, the sole survivor of a civilization at war who mistakenly created a machine that produced techno-organic monsters known as Zeravires, intended to raise the opposing side to ash. But they summarily lost control of the system. Sandman fled to Earth, hoping to stop any other worlds from falling to the Zeravires, and to do so created a collection of machines that, when piloted by individuals capable of withstanding the gravitational stress the machines produce to power them, can form the series' titular robot, the super heavyweight god, Gravion. And once one looks past the large chest of ensemble member Mizuki Tachibana, you find that the show here is just a mix of tongue-in-cheek fun and character-driven drama and storytelling. As unlike the assholes of Gainer, the character conflicts which engage a viewer in Gravion are far more organic as they are based upon contrasts of character. Eiji, as well as Mizuki, wants to find his sister, but Sandman and his aide's secret-keeping frustrates them both and strings them along for their own purposes. One of the pilots is a maid that panics over everything, as the task of being a co-pilot is nothing she was prepared for. Another is a younger girl still growing into herself, not like that, and lacks life experiences which make her reckless, while another is an emotionally distant amnesiac that struggles to make meaningful connections and is consequently indecisive. Each of the cast members has reasons behind their idiosyncrasies, and the story is consequently driven not by an adherence to moving from plot point to plot point, but by the comedy interplay that forms between them that is not focused upon them from chasing a plot point. This helped that the screenwriter who wrote the series, Fumihiko Shimo, is known for and really good at writing character interplay without crossing any lines. Anime they have worked on including Die Guard, Full Metal Panic, Burst Angel, the Studio Dean Fate Stay Night adaptation, Haruhi Suzumiya, and Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid. In fact, much of the story happens to be driven by the dynamic between Eiji and the final member of the team that is the main pilot for Gravion and acts as the deuteragonist of the story, Toga Tenkuji, an emotionally distant person that is so focused on the mission before him that his empathy towards others and the possibility of collateral harm is deeply damaged thanks to being abandoned as a child. Much of the drama of the series turning upon Eiji and Toga's interactions, which is more clear if you watch the series with the Japanese audio turned on, where the characters are then voiced by Kenichi Suzumura and the man who is Zero himself, Jun Fukuyama. And it is largely suspected, though never confirmed, that Gravion outdoing Tamino is what put most of the actors in the series who did not have significant careers yet on the map for some of their later roles, such as Kenichi Suzumura cast after this to play Shin Asuka in Gundam Seed Destiny. Fukuyama was more notable in this, however, as looking at the man's credits, Toga was his first major role as a member of the main cast, and one so critical to the dynamics the show was founded upon. Before this, Fukuyama played background and minor characters near exclusively, and that only began to change after this series, which had showed he could hold his own, with him then moving on to the recurring character role of Searchman in the Rockman.exe anime series, before he cemented himself as a high-profile voice actor with his role as Lelouch. Since Code Geass, he's been everywhere, from being Ultraman Mebius, Baron Nero in Russia Sentai Tokyo, where he was admittedly completely wasted as that series was awful, Joe Shimamura in more recent Cyborg 009 media, Roy in Fire Emblem and the Smash Brothers, Yumichika Ayasegawa in Bleach, Hao in the Pokemon Sun and Moon series, and of course, Phantom Thief of Hearts Joker in Persona 5 and Persona 5's related media. And that's a big one, because Joker is very overtly based on the character of Lelouch himself. Like, it's not even a joke how much Persona 5 draws homage to Code Geass. But that's for me to discuss later. And that isn't the only one Fukuyama has been cast to play since that draws upon his portrayal of Lelouch.
その名は捨てた。今の僕はジョン・スミスだ。
そんなんでわからない。あなたができることも私にはできない。だけどそれでもあなたを支えたいの。理解したいのよ。私を救ってくれたあなたのために。あなたにとって私はもう必要。
全てが終わった時に知るだろう。この選択が最善だったと。
And to begin a proper discussion of the cast in this, acting across from Fukuyama in the series as Callan was in turn Ami Koshimizu, who had risen to prominence hard and fast when she began her voice acting career at 17 in 2003, beginning with her debut role of Nadja Applefield in the series Tomorrow's Nadja, Tenma Tsukamoto in School Rumble, and Sumi Reiko Ichijo in the series Futakoi, with her role as Callan only further raising her note as a valuable and diverse talent. Her cast after this as Yukiko Amagi in Persona 4, Toma Asama in Horizon in the Middle of Nowhere, Ryuko Matoi in Kill la Kill, Ursha in Cross-Ange Rondo of Angels and Dragons, Shizuri Meltdowner Mugino in the Raildex franchise, Makoto Kino aka Sailor Jupiter in Sailor Moon Crystal, Mai Shiranui ever since King of Fighters 14, Yang Xiaolong in the Japanese dubs of Ruby, Saika Amagi and the AI Aika in .Hack Link, Eleanor Hume in Tales of Berseria, the aforementioned Perun in Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and I believed Ami Koshimizu was cast to play her specifically because Kimura was the designer of the character, and most critically of note in all of this, the wolf spirit Hollow in Spice and Wolf. Yeah, Ami Koshimizu has become known for playing many people's favorite waifus. And I say most critically with Spice and Wolf as there was a thing that happened with that anime which debuted in 2008, after Code Geass R1 wrapped up. For across from Ami as Hollow, there was Jun Fukuyama again, playing Hollow's eventual lover and husband, Kraft Lawrence. And both of them have reprised their roles of Hollow and Lawrence in the new adaptation of that series that is releasing in 2024, Merchant Meets the Wise Wolf. But we will come back to that later when it becomes relevant. As for Suzaku in the power trio driving the story, that role was given to Takehiro Sakurai, who was both Fukuyama and Koshimizu's voice acting senior, and how he had begun his career in the 1990s to mostly positive reception, being most known for the given voice of Cloud Strife in Kingdom Hearts and Final Fantasy, but also Tentomon and his evolutions in Digimon, BitCloud in Zoid's New Century Zero, Joe Shimomura, again, in the 2001 adaptation of Cyborg 009, and Ryo Haseo Misaki in the .Hack series. Though most critically I feel for this, being both his role as Mega Man X, as well as Ray Lundgren in Gunsword, the previous anime created by Taniguchi before Code Geass. I feel both X and Ray are key in understanding the casting, because the way Suzaku's character develops is a proper amalgamation of those two characters, but in the worst ways possible. Ray in Gunsword is the diametric opposite of protagonist Vaughn, despite having the same origins of the woman he loved being murdered by a madman. Vaughn keeps his pain internal, while Ray lashes out and expresses his outwardly as his motivation and an excuse to take from others what he needs to reach the common goal they both have of killing the man that ruined their lives. And more importantly, Ray is portrayed throughout the story as being the man in the wrong, going about everything the wrong way to achieve his goals, for no other reason than he cannot accept any other person's viewpoint about how to do those things than his own. Vaughn in Gunsword has lived a life where he's had to listen to others, and lives for them. whereas Rei is too self-focused and insular, that leading him to his eventual death.
俺は逃げたんだ。悲しみから。今も逃げ続けている。そうしなければ俺は死のを失ったことに耐えられない。臆病なのは俺だ。だが、それももう終わる。
我ら罪人、我ら愚か者、新たな世界の血のみ子たち、今日の死の日を受け止める者。
夢を奪われた者はどうなるか知っているか。はあ？どうにもならない。決して埋まらない苦しみに、怒りに、悲しさに、心と体を苛まれるんだ。前の夢は終わった。
But it's from Gunsword that we likewise find the key players in the English dub of Code Geass as well. Johnny on Bosch should need no introduction by this point with how prolific a voice actor he is. Being a member of the Power Rangers in the early 1990s, before transitioning to voice acting with his debut role of Vash the Stampede in Trigun. With a still expanding cast of characters he continues to play even now.
This world is made of!
This world is made of!
Made of love and peace! Can I ask you something?
Yeah, what?
Would you prefer to call off our little game like a sensible adult? Or would you rather get injured and be out of the game for good?
We're nothing like God. Not only do we have limited powers, we sometimes are driven to become the devil himself.
Contrasting this, Karen Strassman started out her career as a theater actor in France, and through her being a dialogue coach for French performers and how to enunciate in English, she discovered her appreciation for voice acting when she began recording language training cassettes for children, leading to her to begin to audition for minor parts in various voiceover roles. Eventually growing into bigger ones, such as Soy Fawn in Bleach alongside Johnny's role as Ichigo. But again, Gunsword is what matters in all of this as the point of intersection, as both she and Johnny were cast as the lovers Michael Garrett and Fasalina, two of the antagonists of the series, serving the true villain of the series, the Claw, as both had been indoctrinated to following through on his plan for a better world, unknowing of the true costs of it. With the irony of their servitude being that both had been saved by the man in the past, and their blind devotion to him had been why they had been led astray, but also how they had found love in the other's arms. Even as Michael had consequently abandoned his sister, the series' leading lady Wendy, as a sign he was forsaking his conscience. The two, amidst being defeated, breaking from the battle, after learning the villain's true schemes and how wrong they were to play parts in it, only to seemingly perish in each other's arms. And it is believed Johnny and Karen were cast together in Code Geass to portray Lelouch and Callan because of the chemistry the two have on display there, appropriately playing through tones and inflections established lovers, and that being the implication left about the latter pair as well on both sides of the Pacific. It's thus unsurprising they've since seen common casting between them, which revolve into such camaraderies and even familial roles time and again, though obviously not the same in every incarnation.
You saw the fortune teller?
I did, and the fortune lady knew you. She said you're a manly,
She was strange. Forget it.
man whore! She said you're one big man whore!
You can also find Suzaku's English voice actor here as well. Yuri Lowenthal in Gunsword plays Joshua Lundgren, the younger brother to the aforementioned Rei, who wanted Rei to approach his revenge from a different way, but was unable to stop his brother from diving directly through to his death. While Suzaku's character clearly draws from aspects of Rei's bullheaded zeal and hatred-driven campaign, the outer kindness Suzaku's masked and public persona emits is very much an echo of Joshua's own personality. At least it is until Suzaku abandons that mask later on in the show. In this light, it is once again showcasing the perfect casting for both English and Japanese dubs of Code Geass, as along these lines is properly amalgamated the two characters into one, though in retrospect, once more being done in the worst ways possible. And obviously Yuri Lowenthal was more than able to deliver on his parting things. Matching a number of times, he ended up doing the English voice roles of characters Takehiro Sakurai also portrayed, as well as both Gunsword and Code Geass, playing part in a pattern of commonly cast anime and video games released over the course of a couple years, where most of the cast of one would meet up again soon after in another production. The English cast of Code Geass also seeing common use in .hack GU, Persona, Bleach, Blue Dragon, Gurren Lagann, and Durarara, just to name a few. All atop Yuri's other performances independent of this group of common names, where he portrayed, say, Ben Tennyson in the Ben 10 series. Granted, this could also just be consequence of there being a common and small voice actor stable from which to pick and cast from on the English side at the time, depending on where and when the casting is being done, and what roles are best performed by the actors. As obviously the environment for English dubs for Japanese series is more removed from the ideas and planning that goes into the actual architects of a story being part of picking and choosing their cast to invoke paratextual homages through actor illusion. And from words from actual casting directors on the subject, it is not uncommon for their choice for one role to be influential in deciding roles for another, if they had been cast together before, to get the emotional and character beats needed to represent a cast properly from the information the dub teams may have going in. But Code Geass seems to be one of those series where cast-wide nearly every choice ended up fantastic, bar one that was forced upon the creative staff by Sunrise on the Japanese end, which we do not blame their English actor for. Generally, good job on the English casting directors for their part in that. But the same, unfortunately, cannot be said of the actual performance brought by the English director. The late Kevin Seymour acted as the ADR voice director for the English dub of Code Geass, and it shows. For any time the man served as an ADR director, the inflections for characters had a notorious reputation of being flat or out of intended tone for the cast of characters, leading to wildly divergent interpretations that would have been intended and found from the Japanese audio, and a bad habit developed for audiences of those media taking away the wrong views of the cast because of it. This is not detrimental to every series he ever did the ADR directing for. His work on Ghost in the Shell's anime dubs are actually all the better for it, as those were stories where underplaying emotions worked out for it. The same for the muted tones on the Big O that he had the same role in, as it helped carry the moroseness of the setting. It is not as harmful to the acting in .hack Liminality or the original IMOC game tetralogy, as what is important there is delivered. But then you look at, well, him being the director for Silent Bomber.
Back then, the battlefield was all I knew of the world. And the voice that issued orders to me, was the only thing I could believe in.
It's an enemy stronghold. Burn down the entire installation.
Roger! Those are... But I thought there were soldiers in here! These people are civilians!
Burn everything to the ground.
But...
That's an order.
Or Street Fighter the Motion Picture in the anime series 2V.
I'd like Bison myself, because he killed my father. But first and foremost, I do my job here, Guile. My duty as an agent comes before personal feelings.
And from there, you start to see the problem, as characters who are supposed to have emotional range, have little character beats and inflections that have to be carried to convey the stories correctly, are not being hit when they should be. They're becoming more reliant on the involved actors' talents to try and reach those notes and the inflection blind, and they do not always succeed. I have adored Johnny Yong Bosch as an actor since he debuted on Power Rangers in 1994, but he does not hold a candle to the sheer passion and range Jun Fukuyama put into portraying Lelouch. He has done better work elsewhere. The same for Karen in playing Talon. Ami's performance is just that more equally emotive and subtle in her inflections and you feel the passion of the character from it. And Yuri performs Suzaku's known and ridiculed acts of self-deceptive hypocrisy completely straight and honest, with no sign of the argumentative edge to his proclamations, and that they are the lies they are. Done in that way, as if challenging someone to debate his indefensible positions to prove his lies right, which can be found in the Sakurai portrayal. They are not reaching as deeply into the spirit of the characters as the Japanese VAs did. This is not a snub to them, or the rest of the cast talents or English dubbing in general, as I love so many of these actors and their work. It is just a fact that Okouchi and Taniguchi knew what they wanted from the cast to deliver what they could, especially due to the aforementioned tie-in content problem, and the English VAs, despite their perfect casting for the roles at hand and the story direction in play, just did not convey everything fully. And you do get a different experience with the show by watching it with the Japanese audio and subtitles on. This is not a new observation. This has been an active debate that has been made again and again since the show released. And yet in all that time, it was never brought up that this all came about from a track record of stilted performances gotten out of the same recurring ADR director. That was frankly wrong for this series, but would have and did work better in other ones. And this does not mean you can't enjoy the series through just the dub, just that it adds another level of missing information with regards to putting in context the greater story. Though as we finally start to move on to the actual series, well, even when rewatching just R1 while excluding all consideration of the stuff that later breaks it, in isolation R1 is still really good. Much of the character dynamics we get read as well-played chess moves with the give-and-take relationship most of them share. As I have a weakness for tsundere characters, Callan's depiction of one having to actively rein in herself, but hate that she can't be herself due to the masquerade, is spot on. As is that hatred of enforced falsehood, half the reason she then bears the tsundere traits in the first place when she is allowed to be herself. Due to how balanced with regards to Tsun, she actually is from everything she is angry over being 100% valid. That tsundere trait likewise appearing infrequently in Lelouch's mannerisms. When people get too close to the truths of himself, he tries not to expose. As Lelouch is terrified of getting close to people, only to lose them again as part of his abandonment issues. Lelouch jumbling his many persona to fit the situation is engaging, as you bit by bit see the commonalities between them that show the true him despite his many facades and the act he puts on. It being shown over time that the face he shows while hidden behind the mask of Zero is the closest to the true him he is permitted to be, as he becomes less focused on hiding himself when his face is concealed. And his complete physical weakness, while often played for laughs, highlights his own shortcomings and how flawed a person he is, still resisting full commitment to everything he must do to eventually face the challenges before him. His misplaced belief, bordering at times on sheer arrogance, that his tactical thinking will allow him out of such circumstances results in him generally struggling to plan for the worst-case scenario and adapt to the unexpected. And that's all while it's shown more and more that the ideals Suzaku adheres to are nothing but a fallacy that outright acts in ignorance to the reality he lives in, which he actively ignores. Them all an excuse to avoid facing the truth and consequences of his actions and what they have wrought. Which spirals into worse and worse atrocities throughout the series he bends over backwards to justify.
あなたが民を裏切ったのです。手を汚してまで玉座を手にし、何を得た?
Everything genuinely good about the series is presented from these angles and affect how things play out. The tactics and strategies shown in the battles are something that had been done in more recent shows at the time, and remain engaging with their execution, even when you know what to expect. Watching the series with someone who's never seen it before and see their eyes go wide with what Lelouch pulls off is an experience in and of itself. And the nightmares were once more something unique that hadn't been done in quite the same way before. While they're on a similar size range to the armored troopers of the series Votoms or the aura machines in Aura Battler Dunbine, and are meant to call upon similar levels of agility as those death traps pull off, most nightmares are designed for the survivability of the pilot in mind, and place emphasis on such extreme environmental agility that they don't need to last through tank fire, just evade them. And the truly outstanding battles come about when the ace pilots of the series can cut loose, especially with their armament the Slash Harken, a tethered grappling line that can be used to attack enemy units or increase the options to evade or use the environment to one's advantage as they do, which themselves draw basis from the grappling anchors of the Sword Strike and Strike Noir Gundams of the Seed series, as well as the Heat Rod grapplers of the Goof series mobile suits. Coupled with the truly outstanding nightmare frames of the series like Callan's Guren, which itself plays part in a recurring G Gundam allusion with her character, as the Guren's Radiant Wave Surger weapon acts as an expanded ability version of the Burning Finger, and you have some very dynamic displays. And yes, the G Gundam homage is deliberate, not just because Taniguchi did work on G Gundam, but Callan's mother in the series is voiced by Yuri Amano, who previously voiced Rei Mikamura from that series. It's implied that had her father ever appeared, he would have been voiced by Tomokazu Seki to complete the illusion, but Callan's father is not at any point part of her actual life. Regardless, coupled with Goro Taniguchi's directing, there's a lot of memorable combat seen here, all brought together by the writing of the tactics on display by Okouchi. More than that, while the series is heavily a political drama as well, it complements one of its source inspirations in this. Much of Code Geass can be seen as a reimagining of the series Gundam Wing, with similar imperialistic themes and subject matter being put on display in ways analogous to how such was handled in Gundam Seed, through real-world story allusions. While Gundam Seed took inspiration for its story from the 9/11 terrorist attack and subsequent military reactions to that event, as well as its own recreation of the thematic plot arcs of the George Lucas Star Wars trilogy, as Seed's core creators were fans of Western science fiction, Code Geass's own takes some inspiration from the American invasion and then occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan, with Britannia once more the America XB, and Japan in this case a proxy to Afghanistan. Or, as is also likely, a reinvention of a more hostile occupation of Japan by America in the wake of World War II, which occurred from 1945 through 1952. A similar stretch of time between when Code Geass's Britannian invasion took place and when the actual revolution in its tale is set, only mixing in more modernist capitalism interpretations and the criticism of noble castes into the narrative to actually give it a direction to its, quite literal, class warfare. Or at least, that is one way of interpreting it. Taniguchi and Okouchi, however, have their own perspective on what they used as their basis. And with Taniguchi previously working on Gundam Wing, well, that's where the aesthetic and thematic bleed over comes from. I mentioned before that Okouchi liked to draw on other Western works as foundation for his own through adaptation, with G-Witch's structure being based on The Tempest and Gainer coming from the Ice Company. Hell, Lupin Part 5 in some respects is just another means of adapting content from the original Maurice LeBlanc Lupin stories. And Code Geass, in turn, is in fact a very loose transliteration of Shakespeare's epic play, Hamlet.
I offer a toast. The undiscovered country. The future.
Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 1.
You've not experienced Shakespeare until you have read him in the original Klingon.
For those of you who don't know, Hamlet is the story of the fictitious Prince Hamlet of Denmark, which takes place in the aftermath of his father's murder, and the throne being usurped by his uncle Claudius, in a time wherein there is unrest over Denmark, in the story, having recently conquered the neighboring country of Norway. Hamlet, seeing specters of his father's ghost that reveal to him his uncle's acts and tyranny, hides his scheme to dethrone his uncle behind a mask of laughing insanity, even as his mother deliberately looks the other way to Claudius's deeds. This eventually escalates to Claudius attempting to directly kill Hamlet through sending Hamlet to another country wherein agents under his employ will kill him, only for Hamlet's life to be saved, ironically enough, by Norwegian pirates displaced from their lives thanks to Denmark conquering Norway. Hamlet returning to confront Claudius in the wake of this attempt, which acts as proof of his uncle's villainy, only to summarily be poisoned by the blade of a man he was forced to duel, before finally slaying his traitorous uncle. His final act being to name the Prince of Norway that had previously been deposed by his family the right to rule in his stead, bringing peace to the land from the act. And to each, thine own self, be true. There's a lot I'm skipping in there because Hamlet is a very dense story, it being a 6-act play and among the longest Shakespeare ever wrote. And there's a lot of parallels between characters in that and Code Geass, though they do not always align correctly. There's at least 3 characters in Code Geass who could feasibly be the equivalent to Polonius, a character who is portrayed as being wrong in literally every decision that they make, as they actively gaslight others into making worse and worse decisions because he is a moron. One of the candidates for that, of course, being Suzaku. Callan takes the position of Hamlet's companion and most stringent ally Horatio, the Black Knights that of the pirates that assist Hamlet, Euphemia that of Ophelia, a woman driven mad that is led to her death, Cornelia that of Ophelia's sibling Laertes, who blames Hamlet wrongly for the madness inflicted upon her sibling. We'll talk about that in a bit. Though, from the greater narrative, Suzaku could also be a Laertes XP, because Ophelia and Laertes in the play were Polonius's children, and Laertes sought to kill Hamlet for something that was not his fault. Hell, in Code Geass, the individual responsible for murdering Lelouch's mother and every other major machination against him is in fact his uncle, and his father, like Hamlet's mother in the play, looked the other way to those acts because he doesn't care, and the lives of his children do not matter in comparison to what he can gain were his plans to be achieved. Unlike G-Witch, however, it is not as overt in these parallels. There are, of course, differences, such as all the offhand references made to Arthurian and Celtic lore throughout the series. But naming motifs can both act as, and yet also not be representative of, a foundational story basis, depending on how some themes may be considered. But the more deep divergence from just a straight adaptation, I feel may have been some of Taniguchi's influence coming in, if it was just not the executive meddling the series experienced itself interfering, on top of the Paratext problem. For if you ask Taniguchi himself, he'll tell a different story, and claim that a central influence behind the series from his viewpoint was Kamen Rider. Kamen Rider, for those who have never seen the franchise, yeah, I used to do reviews of it until Toei's fraudulent content ID claims caused me to stop, is a live-action superhero franchise that began in 1971. Originally about a human transformed into a grasshopper-themed cyborg due to the machinations of a cult-like organization named Shocker that had its origins from within the Axis power Nazis. Their plots being to convert people into an indoctrinated army of literal monsters to service their own schemes and terrorize the people into compliance. The titular Kamen Rider having that brainwashing fail thanks to traitors within the organization, and rebelling against their attempts to enslave the world and make it go wrong. And while the original Shocker was defeated by the end of the original series, it had successor organizations pop up in the sequel series to it, which show that evil is not so easily defeated. Though more modern renditions of the franchise rarely touch on the subject matter in the same ways, the core ideology of rebelling against those who act to make the world go wrong is still an enduring one present in the better entries.
夢を持つとな、時々すっごい切なくなるが、時々すっごい熱くなる。俺には夢がない。でもな、夢を守ることはできる。Standing by. 変身。Complete. この程度で私の計画が止まるとでも思うのか。止めるさ。何度でも。たとえお前らがどんなに強大な悪でも、フードを泣かせる奴は許さねえ。その心そのものが仮面ライダーなんだ。さあ、お前の罪を数えろ。一
ぱい失敗してます。貧しい国に募金してたつもりが悪い人に使われちゃってたり、ひどい時は内戦の資金になってたり。人が人を助けていいのは自分の手が直接届くところまでなんじゃないかって。俺はこんぐらい。まあ届かないことはありますけど、欲望だとしてもこんぐらいなら手に負えますしね。
何が分かっただエイジ。お前なんか欲しいと思ったことあんのか。
欲しかったはずなのに諦めて蓋して目の前のことだけを。どんなに遠くても届く俺の腕、力、もっともっと。おお、叶ってた。お前からもらってたんだ。ありがとう。
私には万物を超越した力があるはず。メンライダーとカイザーシステムの決定的な違いを教えてやる。誰一人見捨てないために。世界中のダチを守るためにライダーロケットドリル系。2つの世界を未来につなぐために。この手が届く世界を守るために。世界中の人々の笑顔を取り戻すために。この力を愛と平和のためにこの力を使う。それが仮面ライダーだ。
And the franchise is culturally iconic in Japan, with many audience members in the 1970s and 80s growing up to create works inspired by their various entries. And Taniguchi's aesthetics of heroism, as showcased by Scride, Gunsword, and even Back Arrow, is largely based on the heroes of those ages who took a stand against normalization of oppressive evils. And the same core ideology of the franchise is likewise reflected in the characterization of Lelouch as one of the truest things about him. And it is one that continues to this day, the running entry as I record this being Kamen Rider Gotchard. But the single most popular of those series that has played influence on later works was Kamen Rider Black, with it and its direct sequel RX being officially imported in 2023 by Discotek Media, and had as its central narrative a supernatural cult abduct two men who were all but brothers by blood, alter their bodies into superhumans, and then expected them to fight to the death in order to determine who was stronger among them to in turn be crowned the Creation King to succeed in the duties of the current Creation King that held the position, and those powers would allow the winner to subjugate the world. The story's main character, Kotaro Minami, the titular Black, escapes from being under their control and fights against them, while his brother Nobuhiko, who becomes the villainous Shadow Moon, is fully indoctrinated into their way of thinking, emerging later in the series to pursue fulfillment of their goals, and the murder of his brother to gain the power to take the position of king for himself and obtain world domination. Does that sound like any series you might know? And I have released reviews on that series no less than 3 goddamn times because it is genuinely that good a story for the era it was written in. And as influential as any of the others or ones following it might have been, it is this dynamic between the separated brothers that is the strongest pull even now. Kotaro wanting to reconcile with Nobuhiko, but the control placed on Nobuhiko is just too strong. So ultimately to end this conflict, Kotaro must stop Shadow Moon and kill Nobuhiko as consequence. There is no other way around that, as the Shadow Moon identity that has been forced upon him is preventing a resolution to everything else. If Kotaro does not, he instead will die, and with his fall, a tyrant oppressing humanity will be allowed to sit on the throne. And that tension and drama unfolding is what keeps drawing audiences back to it even after all these years. Because it is a story that has never been successfully replicated in the entire Kamen Rider franchise. I mean, some series have tried, them building a red Oni, blue Oni dynamic between two of the characters to do so, but the issue is the franchise keeps failing to declare one of these characters to be outright villainous in their behavior, even when they are demonstrably in the wrong and need to be stopped. 4 of the worst series in the franchise each trip over the mistake of making the character that is in the wrong the lead title protagonist of the tale, and then spending the series bending over backwards trying to sell them as in the right when they are objectively not. And the others which attempt it, much like Code Geass, end up having people mistakenly believe the character who was written to be in the wrong, that is not the main character, be the one who is more firmly in the right, when the show itself does not support that and goes out of its way to disprove the notion. The best example I can actually give of that is 2006's Kamen Rider Kabuto, where this dynamic is forged between characters Soji Tendo, the titular Kabuto, and Arata Kagami, who eventually becomes Kamen Rider Gattack. Tendo is the world-wise one of the two, seeing things as they are and having trained himself from before the series began to take on the powers of Kabuto to fight against the worms, an alien species of insect-themed shapeshifters who are slowly encroaching on and infesting the planet with doppelgangers of people the worms aggressively murder. But in the background, there is also a separate faction of worms called natives that have been split between wanting to coexist with humanity and those who have already usurped control of the government, which the writer powers of the series were originally forged to fight against by the coexistence faction. But these other worm factions cannot be acknowledged or confronted openly until the ones aggressively attacking are thwarted, which is where Kagami comes into things. As Kagami, due to his untrained myopic naivete and refusal to improve himself, is blindly supporting the actions of the governmental native worms and their schemes to subvert the rebellion of Tendo against them, masquerading their actions as securing for the people peace and stability, with them desiring control over all of those with the rider powers, even though the ultimate goal of both the aggressive and governmental worms is to wipe humanity out and replace them entirely, and with them the coexistence faction as well. Among those coexistence members is Tendo's technical sister, as Tendo's mother was pregnant when she was copied and killed by one of the native worms, thus leading to that worm-originating sister being born without the sins of the parents, and a knowing of her own inhuman nature, which would be revealed in the aggressive actions of the other two. So, Tendo, in turn, acts to defend her, humanity, and the peaceful worms.
俺はすでに未来を掴んでいる。そしてこれからも掴み続ける。
Even as Kagami, unknowing of all this, stumbles in and makes everything worse by his refusal to actually listen or grow from his experiences, only assume that he knows what is best.
あのネックレス、人間をネイティブにしてしまうものだ。
お前の言うことなどもう信じない。お前は俺の仲間を、真の平和を求める仲間を倒した。お前にはなくても俺は俺の道を行く。
And the show is clear that Kagami is supposed to be in the wrong throughout it by his refusal to grow up and change. That is literally the only way the show works. But audiences, stupidly, did not pick up on this, thinking that there is an actual arc to Kagami's growth when none is present. Why? Because Tendo, as a character, is one that is a bit egotistical, in the same way Lelouch is presented as being.
兜の正体はあなたなの？
太陽に向かってあなたは太陽ですかと聞くか。
なぜあなたがライダーベルトを持ってるの？
太陽に向かってなぜ輝くと聞くか。
But unlike others with that character defect, he's someone that has an ego because he can back it up. He is a character who trained himself for the job he knew he had to do, and the show itself is showcasing that training paying off because he could not afford to fail, lest it all prove meaningless. He doesn't present himself as overtly changing, not because he is stuck in his ways, but because he is an individual who underwent character development before the series began. And even then, he shows himself as a flawed man, just doing the best he can with the knowledge he bears, which is itself the merits of the character, presenting that anyone can change and improve themselves to not repeat the mistakes of the past, but not abandon the truth of themselves in doing so.
たとえ世界を敵に回しても守るべきものがある。俺はそのために7年間準備してきたんだ。絆とは決して断ち切ることのできない深いつながり。たとえ離れていても心と心がつながっている。
Kagami, however, does not have this going for him. He is a character who, like Suzaku, makes excuses for his failings, promotes an ideology he himself does not follow, and serves a corrupt status quo that is only detrimental to the well-being of the people, and through the course of the show, proves that he cannot be trusted as he repeatedly damns the people to death, even up to its finale. And Tendo always has to clean up his messes.
俺たちが力を合わせれば誰にも負けない。
Now, I bring up Kabuto explicitly because when putting Code Geass in the terms of it drawing basis from Kamen Rider for elements of its tale, well, Code Geass debuted in late 2007, the year immediately after Kabuto aired. I know professional Japanese authors, screenwriters, directors, hell, even game company CEOs, that still watch even into adulthood both Kamen Rider and its sibling series Super Sentai. So while the better guess from a foundational basis might be the original series or Black, it could just as easily have been Kabuto instead that acted as inspiration. And Kabuto is a series I would actually recommend people, just with an asterisk attached to it that the main and secondary writers for the series have baggage and writing issues to their work, so events do not always come across the right way to audiences. Again, sound like any series we're discussing? But for 2006, the choreography of the series is fantastic, it has visual flares to it that Hollywood wouldn't figure out how to do until a decade later, and there's a lot to laugh at as Tendo spends a fair chunk of the series just outright trolling everybody else he's up against to lure them into making mistakes he can exploit. To many people, including myself, Tendo is representative of what Lelouch would have looked like had he actually put everything into preparing himself for his quest to defeat Britannia from the start, instead of his jaded acceptance that such was the only path forward for him when it was far too late for him to train. And now watch as they have to walk back this entire last tangent by putting what the franchise actually does, which I feel like I need to explain first, into context to what Taniguchi actually said. For in the interview where Taniguchi revealed this influence, he says that Lelouch's Black Knights are not the Kamen Rider equivalent in this story, despite them rebelling against oppressors and conquerors like a Kamen Rider would, but instead the Black Knights are like Shocker, the original villain organization of the franchise, and it's Suzaku that is the Kamen Rider equivalent in their plans.
邪魔をしないでくれって言っただろ。助けて助けて。
あれが神林さんの考える正義ですか？あれがやりたかったことなんですか？
And this, ladies and gentlemen and others, is why I have been stating more and more as of late that directors are not writers, and we need to stop crediting all of what a series does to them instead of the writers, as a lot of the time the directors, and also the producers on a production, don't know jack about the properties they had that role on, and are responsible for their worst decisions as they don't pay attention to what was actually showcased. This interview from last year showcases a malicious level of media illiteracy and negligent ignorance to the series Taniguchi is claimed to be the co-creator of. For let me restate this for the people in the back. Shocker are a cult of Nazis! They were deliberately written to be successors to Nazi ideologies to teach and act as a thematic deterrent against impressionable youth from supporting such literal monsters by showing the merits of rebelling against people with power or authority that are acting wrongly, as that had demonstrably in real life screwed their country over and into suffering by how they were forced to bow their heads to the imperialist authoritarianism.
Nazis? I hate Nazis.
Shocker quite literally promotes the same social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, once power is all that matters, the weak can go fuck themselves, bullshit, that Britannia and the Code Geass narrative itself embodies, Suzaku serves, and Illusion as allies fight against, complete with Britannia having a cult that the Emperor of the Nation sits at the head of, alongside his closest co-conspirator, that services their personal needs and whims with the goal of rewriting what humanity is, in the same way Shocker does. Code Geass literally showcases a world where the Shocker equivalent is in the process of conquering the world. You can't escape that. This is the literal allegory.
Does that sound like a hero?
Well, when you put it like that, not really, but,
Then what the hell, man? What the actual hell?
And this is not limited to the original series either to show this is something silly from a 1970s series that doesn't appear past the 1980s. This is continued thematically in later ones atop that. Kabuto, at the time, as I said, was the biggest representation that such a fight continued on. And Kagami in that story was a clear Suzaku equivalent with his enabling of the conquerors in their midst until they didn't need him anymore.
Kabuto はもういない。俺が倒した。全然ねえよ。ネイティブにする。
And 15 years after that, the franchise is still quite literally showcasing the same thematic identity in everything but its bad entries, which numbers at like 5 or 6 in total out of 40-ish. And most of the bad ones have the same awful producer attached to them fucking that up. It's a surprisingly consistent track record, even if some series are more overt and successful at that showcase than others.
お前が望んだ力とは何だ。全てを破壊するその力では何者も救うことなどできない。母を奪った運営を憎み、全てを破壊する。それがお前の理想の世界か。
いつめのおかげで我々は力を手に入れた。世界を意のままに作り変える力をね。
ひどい。
創世の女神よ。グランドエンドを実行せよ。
破壊を願うのか。全てを破壊して作り変えることだ。俺の理想の世界に。
さらばだ、世界よ。グランドエンド完了。
この世界は終わらない。これは俺の手で叶えてみせる。理想の世界を。お前が壊した世界は俺が作り変える。 Boost Tactical Factory Boost 9 Strike.
So this statement by Taniguchi is a complete 180 inversion of what is factually true about Code Geass from an objective viewpoint when one is aware of this, and utterly baffling considering Taniguchi's other series that are also about personal rebellions against quite literal oppressive monsters.
そんなこと 私が負ける。これがそれだけが俺の自慢の拳さ。
And even beyond best comparison, there's numerous hero narratives about this sort of fight that, to call those rebelling against an actual fascist authoritarian nation state evil? No, it is wrong, showcasing another way in which the franchise and its cast were mishandled. This is not something that can be countered as a difference of opinion one can disagree over. This is something that has to be completely rejected as nonsense. As for those who aren't that aware or into Japanese series to show why this was so egregious an error, well, to do some Western media comparisons, it's like claiming Bruce Wayne grew up to be the Joker instead of Batman, or that Steve Rogers was always a member of Hydra, so this would have been done with sincerity instead of said by an imposter.
From my point of view, the Jedi are evil. Well, then you are lost!
Genuinely, truly, I have to ask this. What were you thinking? Were you thinking? Like, yeah, I get it. This is all things from an interview 15 years after the show ended, and seems like something odd to get angry about. But it's just the latest in an assortment of bad takes and bullshit from Taniguchi, which he has voiced specifically about Code Geass, that flies in the face of what the show actually did and presented inside of itself. It showcases how everyone who worked on the show was not acting in good faith towards its development. Explains so very much about the problems and baggage the series over time would gain, and the audience's rejection of the later decisions, such as the utter atrocity that is the series' movie timeline. It does a lot to discredit any claim Taniguchi makes about the series having any form of valid grounding. If he gets something this fundamental wrong regarding a series he is the co-creator of. And with exception to whenever Sunrise executives would intervene, likely he was the one who had final say over what was done with events and characters due to the position he held in the series, possibly making him more responsible than Okouchi for the myriad of missteps the series showcases over time. And considering the nature of some of his statements and the discourse tied to them, yeah, that accounts for about 3/4 of the fandom's discourse in and of itself. Like, genuinely, I cannot understate how bad that declaration is, as someone who likes and is a fan of that franchise, to have put his words into context. It makes me lose major respect points towards him with that assertion. I'll see you all back here next time for part 2 of this absurdity.